we've been doing this every day, I feel, since the 26th of August. So it's been very, very a great experience for me. And so I think we're going to do 3 projects in each session. I know some of you are here for the whole morning. Some of you will come in and out. I think it'll be quite fluid. And so I'm just gonna stop my share and go back to the gallery. Lauren, can I re-host myself? I think I can make myself host again. Hold on. Maybe not. Okay. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome our morning jury. Let me get my notes out. First of all, Alexander Eisenschmidt, my colleague at UIC, author of The Good Metropolis and working on a book on Felix Kandela.
Yes, Claire, I'm changing it right now. You're live. You're good to go.
Thank you. Thank you. Just introducing Alexander Eisenschmidt from UIC. Also like to introduce Iker Gill, Executive Director. Thank you. Just introducing Alex. Okay, sorry, there's some feedback there. Oh my God. Iker Gill, Executive Director of the SOM Foundation and founder of Mass Context, an architectural platform for editing live events and some books here in Chicago. Iker is also presently the chief curator at Exhibit Columbus in Indiana, so we're all looking forward to that. Joyce Wang is joining us from the University of Buffalo, where she is the associate chair and director of undergrad and graduate programs. She's also director of Ants of the Prairie, that looks at contemporary ecological conditions and wildlife habitats in constructed environments. Jessie Le Cavalier is associate professor and director of the PhD program at the University of Toronto and author of The Rule of Logistics, and has also written widely on the topic of distribution systems and automated systems. Great to see you, Jessie. Marina Ortero, I'm delighted to say, is joining us from Rotterdam. She's the director of the HNI, and we've been very interested in Marina's project on automated landscapes in our studio, which also formed part of her curatorial of the Dutch Pavilion at the Venice Biennale in 2018, called Work, Body, Leisure. And interestingly enough, Marina was also one of the jurors for the SOM Prize. So it's great to have you, Marina. I hope that we lived up to the proposal. Bob Sommel, Bob, I think you're here, director of the program here at UIC, is also joining us. So welcome, everyone. Thank you very much. I'm very excited. Before we go into the project, has anyone any just questions, jury, clarifications to make? Sorry, that was a bit of a frazzle start, so good to go? Okay, thanks, Lauren. Our morning session, 3 projects, Hafsa, Madison, and Siva. The students are going to present from the website, so we have formatted everyone's project in a very similar way. The students will start with a short 2-minute plus movie that really just throws you right into the project, and then comes out to sort of backtrack to give a bit of the research and present the drawings. We didn't want to sort of be chronological and start with the research and then it's straight in and then pulling out and back in again. So that's the format for everyone. I've asked the students to present within a 10-minute time frame to allow for comments, and we've about 25 minutes per student. Does that sound okay, everyone? So Hafsa, are you there?
Yep, I'm here. Good morning.
How are you doing? Thank you for starting, Hafsa.
Of course.
You'll be able to have a coffee in 25 minutes and you'll be feeling fantastic.
Yes.
Okay, just remember to optimize for your sound on the video, yes. Hafsa.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to go on mute and it's all yours. Thanks so much.
Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and start the movie. I parked my car and followed several others into the forest. Zone 1, Outer Forest, read the sign. Following the path, I noticed a structure in the far distance, resembling a large commercial greenhouse. As I entered the first climatic zone, the fog, I'm assigned a robot called Navi. Immediately, a cold breeze hits my face as I feel the tiny mist particles within the air settle onto my skin. I can barely see anything. The fog is illuminated by the laser lights coming from Navi. As I walk out of the zone, I enter a long corridor surrounded by huge rooms, which are separated by large glass panels. I begin to notice different areas and different activities taking place within them. Most are post human spaces for robots and plants, and less for humans. I feel like an endangered species here. Fog is not the only climatic zone in this facility. There are 5 different climatic zones, each one sandwiched between a production area on one side and a data center on the other. The climate produced within the zone is a byproduct of the production zone and the data center surrounding it. Rain, humid, light, and cold are the other 4 zones. The white corridors act as a neutralizer between each space. Visitors are not allowed in the production zones but can view the activities taking place inside them through the glass and have their own temperature and light controls as well as their own soil type. The entire space seems to appear as something that would exist on the exterior and the outdoors. However, it's indoors. These transition spaces help move from one space to another by cleansing our minds between each zone. Having humans, robots, and data centers side by side in the same space makes this project a first of its kind towards a new post human era. It gave me an opportunity to view and experience the technology that goes into making the space come to life. It's not just an infrastructure, but also a community friendly space that begins to transform technology and nature into one. So moving on, this project is called Techno Nature, and the concept for this project is mainly 2 elements: post-human and human. Um, so all the components within the project mainly make up the post-human part of the project, while the workers and the public are the only elements that make up the human part. Industrial greenhouses focus on large automated agriculture production, rendering the farm an interior condition. And greenhouse production mainly focuses on fruits, vegetables, and leafy greens that can be produced in large quantities, such as spinach, lettuce, tomatoes, and strawberries, etc. Each crop is grown by automated robots in precisely climate controlled environments, and spacing robots, weeding robots, and conveyor belts are mostly popular in agriculture production. And they're the ones that control the facility. And each crop requires its own temperature, its own water requirements, its own spacing requirements to produce high yields. Um, Hyperscale data centers such as Facebook and Microsoft are similarly vast interior landscapes run by artificial intelligence and robotic systems. And similar to greenhouses, they're also controlled climatic spaces with precise control over air, humidity, and temperature. And in doing so, both the greenhouse and the data center act as post-human environments.
And data in my project moves away from the typical data storage and focuses on storing data related to climate and research, which in turn is related to the project's, which I will get into later, because the project consists of these climatic zones. And basically, this data helps the research for the zones happening within the project. And data centers are typically thought of places to be void of humans, but in technonature, the heat from the data becomes a byproduct that is used by the humans through various activities happening within the facility, and therefore forming an indirect relationship between the humans and the data. Moving on to the site. Um, So most of the data centers in Ireland are currently situated just outside the city of Dublin. Here, the blue icons represent the data centers, and the green ones represent the greenhouses. And most of the greenhouses are in close proximity to the data centers, therefore bringing the agriculture to the data. However, there are a few greenhouses towards the south, and situating my project near these greenhouses gives me an opportunity to bring the data to the agriculture, as well as make the exterior conditions, which are forests and vast open lands, a part of the system of my project. So as you can see here, this is where my project is situated, and this is a dense forest right outside the project. And in situating it right up next to my project gives me an opportunity to make the forest an exterior condition for my project. Um, this is just an aerial view, a bird's eye view of the project, and this is the circulation diagram, which basically shows how the forest acts as an exterior condition. So the circulation path goes into the forest, through the project, and out back to the forest. So it makes this exterior condition the part of the project itself. Um, So the project is comprised of three different zones: production zones, data zones, which are represented here in the green and the blue, and then the public zones. And each zone require its own temperature control. Therefore, the temperature throughout the facility varies. Therefore, you can see the red one being the hottest and the blue one being the coldest temperature. Um, and the curated adjacencies between these spaces gives rise to new atmospheric rooms for the public to inhabit. For example, the rain, the humid, the fog, the clear, the cold, etc. Each atmosphere is the byproduct of the climatic condition required by the production zone and the data zone adjacent to it. For example, spinach here requires constant watering, and therefore the climatic zone that's adjacent to it becomes the rainforest zone, and is therefore the byproduct of the climate that's happening, that's required for the production. The circulation within the project acts as a neutralizer between each space, and its sole purpose is to help visitors cleanse their mind while they're moving from one climatic zone to another. And visitors engage themselves with these environments, forming new relationships through the different activities that are happening within these spaces, and that's how they form these relationships between human to post-human environments. And here is a diagrammatic plan of the entire project, where again, you can begin to see how different climatic zones are situated next to production zones. And each climatic zone gets a production zone as well as a data zone. And therefore, these two elements create the environment that's happening within the public zone for the visitors to experience. Um, and these are just zone plans. This is the plan for the humid zone. And as you can see here, oranges and cucumbers are basically the ones that require the hottest or the warmest temperature between 95 to 100 degrees. And therefore, the zone that's situated between these production areas becomes the humid zone. And the program that happens within these zones is specific to the climate that's being produced within the environments. And other programs such as bathrooms and lounges and cafes are basically situated throughout the project. Um, Another Zoom plan is of the rainforest area. And again, situated right next to the spinach, therefore requires constant watering, and the water becomes then the byproduct in the climatic and creating the climate for the rainforest zone. And then this one is for the fog, and since fog is just the fog basically creates a low visibility surreal environment, which is illuminated by the light coming from the data center next to it. And therefore, it doesn't really have a program because the visibility is really low in the zone. So it's just meant for visitors to experience the fog and the light coming from the data. Moving on to the section. Through the section, you can begin to see the adjacencies between each zone and the structural system that goes into making the project. And the structure comprises of a grid system, and typically greenhouses consist of bays that are 30 feet by 60 feet in width and length. And so each zone then begins to sit right next to each other, and you can see how if someone is within a public zone, they can, for example, in this one, if someone is within a public zone, they can clearly visualize the data zone that is situated right next to it because it's only separated by glazing, and there's a clear visual connection between each zone. Um, and this one is the humid zone right here. So then again, someone in the humid zone is clearly able to visualize what's going on in the production area right next to them. Um, And then moving on to the renders, these are from the movie. This is the outer forest that I talked about in the site, where the outer forest becomes a part of the system. So the circulation goes through the forest, and that is where the visitors begin to see and visualize the uh, greenhouse that is in the far distance. And since the entrance is through the fog begins to kind of seep out and illuminate the surrounding area, which is where they begin to like visually connect with the project. And then the wide corridor spaces just act as neutralizers, and they do not really have any program other than neutralizing the space and helping visitors move from one space to another. This is the fog, the low visibility area. As you can see, there is no program, and it is like literally completely filled with fog. This would be the rainforest zone. I also have another rendering for the rainforest zone. It was kind of a last minute thing where we talked about, since the project is techno nature, this was more moving the rainforest into the technological, I guess, part, and having these trees being mobile, as in they're able to move, making them more technological, and they're tagged, and that's where the data is then being stored into the data server within the facility. And then this is the light zone. And then lastly, the humid zone. And again, the program then in each zone is based off of the climate that's being produced within the public zone itself. And then moving on to the metrics.
I'm gonna give you one more minute. Sorry, I know you're at the end.
Sure, yeah. And moving on to the metrics, basically the metric diagram represents the seeding, production, and harvesting times for each crop, which allows us to see what someone would see when they're visiting this facility at any given time of the year. And it also helps us understand how much produce is being produced and how many people it would feed. For example, if you were to look at tomatoes, you can see that 100 square feet produces 49 pounds, and 24 pounds is required per person annually. Therefore, my project would be producing 22,937 pounds, which would typically feed up approximately feed 955 people annually. And then this is the metrics. This is the phase diagram where if someone were to visit in January, they would be seeing the production of the tomatoes, or if they were visiting in August, they would be seeing the seeding, or if they were visiting from March to July, they would be seeing the harvesting of the tomatoes. So this kind of just helps us visualize what they would be seeing at any given time of the year. Thank you.
Thanks, Hafsa. Thank you for going first too.
Maybe I can start with a question. That's a really fascinating project. Is there somewhere in the plan a record of the scaling of the data centers, the data bundles? Maybe you probably talked about this. We see them in section very clearly here, and I'm just wondering if they increase in scale, size, width, in correspondence to the warmth that they emit or need to emit in order to, warm an area. Because I would think, I mean, I'm really fascinated by the pattern of the plant spacing. And I'm wondering if there should also be a plan that talks about the scaling and the spacing of these the data bundles, for the lack of a better word.
Right. Currently, I've only well, in my project right now, data is just typically following the data structure that you would typically find in a typical data center, but yeah, it's not being spaced differently in any zone. Each data zone is literally the exact same thing. It's just just the sizing matters. For example, in the plan, you can see right here. So the size just depends on the zone that it's being situated next to. But other than that, the data servers themselves are just standard throughout the project.
And in that plan, the servers are in the
so they would be
like
right
this
here in the white zones. Those white spaces would be the data.
I see.
You want to go up to the diagram, Hafsa, just previously.
This one.
And scroll up. No,
right.
Upstairs.
Yeah, there.
Lines there, Alexander, but they don't vary.
Yeah.
Always this kind of standard server aisle, two computers with two servers with a space in between.
It seems like, and I obviously you know more about this technology than I do, but it seems like because you have this heat map there, the kind of temperature diagram, that in order to not deploy additional technology that then needs to cool down area or pump heat from one server to the other room where it needs to be hotter, that there would be some kind of scaling of those data bundles in order to really so that, and I guess I would like that idea, because then there would be also a kind of spatial implication of that of the temperature, not just a kind of marking on the diagram, but a real spatial implication of making it wider and bigger to make that zone, the red zone, warmer, and so that you have a kind of the similar logic than you have for the plants and the kind of spacing of the plants, which I'm really fascinated by this plan, would have some. I think there would need to be some repercussions also in terms of the way that the storage of the data storage would scale. Somehow I want to scroll on your, but I guess I should bring the website up.
Yeah, that's kind of, well, there's no perfect way to kind of present.
Oh no. This comes
that everyone could kind of drive the bus themselves too on your phone or something, or in tandem, if that's helpful.
No, that comes really close to perfect what you're doing here.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yes. Sorry. I'll go.
Go ahead, Marina. Oh, Joyce, it's fine.
Oh, okay. Well, thanks. I just wanted to say that I really appreciate your project, and the video was super compelling to kind of create this ambiance and the kind of sensibility of the project. And I I appreciate all of the and I completely agree with Alexander. I'm also struggling to kind of understand some of the metrics and how that translates to plan and so on. I guess my mind was kind of going in a slightly different direction. Maybe this might feed back to this. I was really just compelled by the kind of surreal quality of your video and some of the statements that you're making, like human feeling like an endangered species and things like that. And some of the qualities that I think are really fascinating are just like the kind of neutrality of the space and the kind of like all-encompassing almost color of like, of this environment, and how this kind of like weird false nature is embedded within it, and how that actually happens. So this idea of like raining indoors and so on. And of course, a lot of that is only made possible through the design of infrastructure. Like, and I'm thinking about things like sprinkler pipes and stuff. And you can see that in the kind of ceiling of your, in some renderings. But part of me is also wondering, like, is there a way to kind of think about that somehow more thoroughly in terms of like, or maybe thorough is not the right term, but maybe spatially or something, so that becomes more present in the way that these environments are being rendered. And maybe this ends up becoming a kind of plan. Like, I would love to almost see like the reflected ceiling plan of your project.
Could you also say like what I think I lost the relationship of the outside forest to the inside forest? Like, what is the point of the inside forest relative to the outside woods?
So the outdoor forest is basically just helping the visitors get into this. So since the circulation goes through the forest, it's just creating this outer environmental condition for them to then get into the indoor project itself. But then the indoor rainforest is a byproduct of, is created through the byproduct of the production zone that's situated next to it, which is the spinach. So then since spinach requires constant watering, the water then becomes the byproduct in creating this rainforest zone within the indoor rainforest zone within the facility. So the outdoor is just an exterior condition that becomes a part of the system of the project, but then the indoor forest is actually the byproduct of the agriculture being produced.
But I guess someone is consciously putting the forest inside the Albert Kahn factory, right? I mean, it's not like it grows by itself. So, I mean, maybe it also is the natural side of Alexander's question, which is, how do you account for the huge amounts of section that are needed for the trees, which are going to be as big at the bottom as hair at the top? They don't stop nicely at a kind of very thin floor plan. They go as deep underground as they are above ground. So, like, I'm just wondering about the section of the project relative to the forest, and how is the Albert Kahn factory the most suitable architecture if we've kind of decapitated all the trees at their trunks? It takes more than humidity to grow a tree, I guess is what I'm saying. So, like, where's all the massive amounts of earth that are required inside the building to accommodate a forest?
Well, that was another thing that we kind of talked about towards the end, where if you can see in my renders. So initially this was the first rainforest, which you're right, like it requires like a lot of structural and earth down below for the trees to grow and stuff, which is why then we were talking about something similar to this, where these would be then mobile trees, so they would not be planted within the structure or in the earth, but then they would be on these movable sort of like boxes of robots, which would be making up the rainforest zone in the project.
Yeah, no, I'm just saying, like, as someone has container plants, you need a much bigger container. You need, as Roy Scheider says in Jaws, you're going to need a bigger boat. You know, you're going to need a bigger planter, because these things, the root system is going to be as big as what is above it, under it. So, like, I think they won't survive on wheels, like file cabinets. So I think somehow it's a little bit. So I'm just wondering, like, because look, I understand the project is rhetorical, and so I think one has to get to the rhetorical side of it, like putting aside the science and technology.
Yeah.
Because you've turned it a little bit into a theme park. Once you turn into a theme park, then public reception matter and aesthetics matter, and you know, it's no longer legitimated by its science and technology anymore. Now it's rhetorical and in quotation marks. And so you have to kind of own the fact that it's a rhetorical project in quotation marks, it's a cultural project. And so the question is, what does it mean to have a post-human public? Like, you know, or what are the aesthetics? You know, there's a kind of Olaf Eliasson aesthetic. There's, you know, I mean, you're making aesthetic decisions, kind of blur building inside the Albert Kahn factory, but I'm not sure they're really in your control, you know, and I think you need to sort of decide what, you know, is this the right aesthetic? Am I trying to make this contrast between, you know, kind of Bruce Dern's silent running, like a spaceship and out, you know, orbiting the Earth with a forest inside of it, and kind of environmental dystopia? Like, I guess I want to know what the sensibility and position is in that way.
Yeah, maybe to
because
follow.
the theme park is a third quality that is neither farm one nor farm two. It's like a meta thing, which seems to be driving it, really. I mean, much more so than either farm one or farm two seems to be theme park 3.
Yeah, maybe to follow on that, I was wondering about the condition of this endless or interior and its limits. So it's indeed a theme park, or is a system that is able to grow and permeate larger parts of the territory. I mean, the simplicity it has suggests that it's something, yeah, more like this utopia or dystopia of this endless interior, that probably the forest that is outside will eventually disappear and everything will be this kind of spaces, climatized spaces. And in that sense, I wonder what is the real relation between these different climates and the interior and exterior. If there is no relation between this interior and the outside world, indeed there is a relation between these climates that are almost adjacent to each other. Because what is important is that in a way you are always talking about byproducts. And I think that's very interesting, how to design with a byproduct. I think that's a logic that has value. But I think what happens here is that there is not only one direction, there are always feedback loops that operate in different directions. So for instance, the number of people who will be inhabiting this space and will be like a walk in the forest, they will also bring certain humidity and levels of CO2 and temperature that will definitely affect the conditions interior. So then what happens in that orangerie will affect, you know, the climate of the servers. So I think that then will bring a much more complex and entangled relation between all these climates and the way in which they are inhabited. Because most of the times that's what happens, these spaces of the data centers are meant to have the minimum human bodies inside, just for a very limited time. And for many different reasons, obviously security, but also these conditions, and also because they are noisy, but their presence does something as well. And that's where it's not necessarily only post-human, it's like kind of a completely sense of, you know, feedback loop between these different elements. And then will create much more interesting relations. But I'm still fascinated by the simplicity of your diagrammatic floor plan. I think there's something interesting about that and imagining its endless repetition. So maybe I will think about that kind of entangled nature of that space as a possible way of thinking too. And then I was maybe wondering, you mentioned sometimes these neutral spaces that in a way allow you to go from one climate to the other. It's like when you are in a menu tasting food and then you need something in between. But to me, this may be a philosophical question. What do you mean by neutral? And what is actually the condition that creates that sort of neutrality, either in the terms of aesthetics, architecture, climate, for which body that condition is neutral, everybody has different. You know, I think that in itself, that only a space could be a fantastic project, or even a PhD thesis about what neutral space could be. So that left me very, very intrigued. Congratulations.
I know we're short on time, but I would maybe just quickly. Okay, good. I think the two things that were just being described. One is the kind of feedback, like cybernetic feedback loop, and then also JAWS make me think about the kind of interesting mix up here in the project that I think could be also, for me, it's making me think about how on one hand, we constitute an idea of nature. And how nature is monstrous or menacing or mysterious, potentially destructive, and then how that is constructed through a process of communication, but also how nature, quote unquote, has its own set of ways of communicating. And it strikes me that one of the things that, the kind of fundamental question you're raising, which is, I think, so fascinating, that by posing these three zones, like the agricultural, the human, and the data, and then the agricultural you're even describing as a kind of, even though it's ostensibly in service of providing food for humans, you're talking about it as a kind of post-human space, almost as if it's indifferent to the humans that will be eventually consuming the food. But it's making me wonder if, in fact, it's even, I guess what I'm wondering is the narrative possibilities here are really rich. And it seems to me one of the pieces of that narrative has to do with the role of the data in general, like the idea of data as a mode of communicating. And because robots use data, trees use data, humans use data, but all in different ways, and how that could start to get scrambled here, because it does seem to me that the three zones remain fairly unchallenged in the project. Like they're fairly intact around identifiable climates, identifiable zones of data, identifiable zones of agricultural production. But I wonder how they might have a feedback loop within the project itself. How would the nature start to get much more monstrous as it, or monstrous not in a sense of kind of menacing, but just like a new kind of form that we're not so aware of. Like the kind of cultural reference that it brings to mind for me is like the writing of Jeff Vandermeer, like the maybe the movie Annihilation, or the kind of strange new forms that we're not familiar with. Because I've been wondering the whole time, like what would attract me to this theme park, especially if there's a forest outside. And so I think that's where I wonder, what the kind of story about participating in the space is. Because it's true, like I think in the context of like, say, watching an Amazon fulfillment center in action, it is like watching a nature show. Like you can't figure out what these creatures are doing. They don't seem to have a logic to them, but of course it's all totally rational, but it's not comprehensible from a human point of view. And so you're, I think, introducing this, but you're talking about it through this more literal, natural system through agricultural production. So I think, if one were to think about it not as a farm, it really is this like machine for producing, organic matter to like keep the humans alive. It raises all these really fascinating questions about like why, who's behind it, like what's the value of keeping the humans alive in general. So I just, it's a long way to say that I appreciate the project, and I have a feeling that it's sort of starting you on a process of really asking some of these fundamental questions about our relationship between both data and nature, and neither of those things will be left intact if you really follow through with the promise of the project, I think.
Iker, I don't know if you wanted to say anything.
Sure. Yeah, I don't want to take any time. I mean, just thinking about.
I didn't want to assume that you couldn't.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Just kind of like going back to the architecture a little bit, like just thinking about you're creating all these space that have a very different conditions. So kind of like paying attention about what is the threshold and what is the relationship between each one of them. Right now in the renderings, you're showing that there is a little bit of maybe treatment to the floor where we have different conditions, but we don't really have more about like, okay, what's the ceiling between the interior and the exterior, or what is the data to the, growing the food, or the data to the people who are in this environment. So I think those are left as, there's kind of like two lines that are like, I don't know if it's glass or what it is, but just like a very thin. So I think thinking about all these thresholds between what Bob was talking maybe about the thickness, but also Joyce was talking about the ceiling, like what are all those interfaces? And I think that could be a great piece, but super interesting.
Okay, Hafsa, do you want to unshare and let Madison in?
Thank you.
Thanks, Hafsa. Okay, Madison, it's all yours.
Hello.
How are you?
Good. So my project's called Harvest Branch, Localized Hybrid Typologies. And I'm just going to go ahead and play the movie.
Madison, I'm going to stop you there. I think that your sound is pretty low. Do you want to try that again?
Yes.
I know we were discussing the optimize audio setting. If you want to select that, it's helpful.
Mm-hmm.
Take your time. Don't worry.
Okay. How is it now?
It's still pretty low my end.
I can see the agri specialist tending to monitor water pipes that led to a specific knowledge trade. The specialist looked over and continued on with their work. The reading rooms of the library we worked through the field like planets and space, moving all the study rooms and that's my time. Throughout this winter, house of grid blue light days. Small blue lights, each representing an archive of information. I store my personal data, all my family photos and files. In return, I can put the case of fresh clothes. I met with a long glass hallway leading to the first reading. I hear distant chatter with sounds of town hall meeting. It's hard to reflect my lighted that slowly reflects on their books and computers. I can see a closer look at the data set. Data center engineers walk through the aisles of the center, cross over to another section, and they continue with their work. This data center has the ability to put the data at the top, our information tools around us. At the same level as the data center mentioned, an agri-specialist checks some trays on a large system, raising it up to me. I'm completely immersed covered. I head back down the lilac hallway to leave. I take the last glance at the cross road around. Back in the floor of the lobby, I say, have a good night to the front desk as I leave. Just as I'm leaving, the fresh farmers market is wrapping up their last sales last night. All the sold produce was grown just inside the walls.
Okay. Sorry about the sound. I hope it came through. So Harvest Branch, this project combines institutional, agricultural, and data technology into a new hybrid configuration as a way to integrate infrastructural program into the community and to foster new relationships between cultural and industrial systems. So the project proposes a new network that localizes data storage and fresh farming. The intentions of the data storage is to remove personal data from the large isolated locations and to relocate them back into the community. Exhaust air from the data center is directly distributed to the greenhouse within the same facility. So hydroponic and aeroponic farming is utilized in the space to achieve the most produce per square foot. In this facility, we'll be growing microgreens, strawberries, and tomatoes. Across Dublin, there's a collection of existing data centers and libraries, specifically along the M50 highway line. The prototype site for the branch is in Tala, a suburb just southwest of Dublin. And the initial site came from the idea of combining these existing facilities into one site. Tala has a population of 75,000, and the proposed site sits on a semi-urban area close to a local shopping mall. So the total square foot of the building is 68,000 square feet, and the sides of the building open up onto the street, where the west-facing wall acts as the entrance of the library. And it also includes a cafe space and a storefront space, and it comes out to the street level. The south-facing wall opens up to the main parking for the space, as well as the entrance to both the greenhouse and the data center, both of which have restricted access. The east-facing wall opens up to an indoor-outdoor farmers market, and the north wall has an industrial loading dock for trucks to move produce from the greenhouse. So the ground floor is mostly greenhouse, including any operational spaces or offices for the workers. Surrounding the greenhouse is the cafe and storefront. And the library begins to interrupt the solid greenhouse in the middle. Through the first floor is the walkways to connect the elements of the library in the grid of the data center, where the data grid and walkways collide at intersections. And on the second floor, the core of the reading rooms continue up to reveal another floor of spaces. And the final floor is the rooftop greenhouse and operational spaces. And the tops of the reading rooms poke out of the floor. So you can see it happening all in section. And then so you have the rooftop farming, continuing down the data bridge and the reading rooms. And then the vertical farming in the lobby and in these outdoor spaces. And so these drawings highlight the atmosphere created when these typologies begin to collide. It also shows how integrated the public is with their food production and data storage. And so because of the vertical farming process, the produce can be grown all year long. Strawberries have a 4 to 5 week grow time, so the facility will be able to have about 12 harvests a year of just strawberries. Tomatoes have a 13-week harvest, and microgreens have a 2-week harvest. These foods aren't meant to be a complete diet, but rather in addition to an existing diet for the people in town. And so the entire data center in the facility can hold up.
So I'm going to ask you, do you want to slide down? I don't know if everyone is seeing the top of your, I think it's the gallery on Zoom, like a rectangle. Do you want to slide that over to the side or down?
Yes, I can't see it on my screen.
Oh, okay. All right. Maybe it's just me.
Yeah, I can't see the gallery, but
okay.
I could always reshare.
No, it's fine. Don't worry. Don't worry.
Maybe I could start just with a to see if you might expand a little bit on some aspects of the project. I think it's a really compelling exploration and a kind of hybrid typology that mixes, neighborhood institution with this emerging technological type that you're dealing with in the studio. And I mean, I know the studio is premised on already a kind of hybrid typology between the farm and the data center, and then now you've added this other branch of civic identity in the library. And I think the movie does a nice job of explaining all the other things the library does, the meetings and so on. But I was curious if you would elaborate a little bit on your thoughts around the kind of credit union equivalent of data center here, the withdrawal of data from the big corporate version and the local use of it, and what you see the implications of that being, and because I think that's that's been sort of on people's minds lately, and I think it's an important question, and I wonder how you think about that relative to the project in general, and then maybe I'll leave it there, and I have other things to say, but I'm curious about that aspect of it.
Yeah, well, I think like a big part of it all is to localize the data. Like right now, one of the issues with these big data centers is that they're very like isolated, and even like when we were studying like research on them, it was really hard to find information. So kind of like reinserting this data, it can make people more aware. Because you think of the cloud, but you don't think of the physical implications of it all.
But right? Well, that's so. One reason then, I guess, for in your case is to make the kind of immediacy of it as a presence. And then, so I guess that by implication, there's some behavioral kind of modification that might ensue as people are. But I think for me, what's interesting is that, I mean, it seems like already you have a kind of surplus of capacity here. I mean, I'm curious about the kind of like the way that data centers situate themselves or are situated within these giant systems. And so, the role of the data center for like the reason people want to withdraw is that the information isn't instrumentalized, isn't monetized, doesn't become part of the sort of algorithmic processes of resource extraction. And you're taking basically data as a currency, and you're taking it out of circulation. It's basically saying instead of investing our money in a bank, we're going to keep it all together and use it for something. But that's for me what I think is really promising about the project is if you think about this not as a farm but as a bank, what can you use to capitalize on, or how does this become valuable? Because if ostensibly you're saying we're sitting on a lot of valuable material, or is it more like libertarian, like we're just withdrawing from the system, we're going to put our money under the bed just because we don't want anyone to touch it. We just want it to be close to us, and we're concerned about what people, like nefarious things people will do with it. Or is it sort of trying to create a different model? Neither of those things might be that active in the current project, but the reason that I think it's important is I think it could actually potentially open on to an expression of the institution itself, like that there could be something that might tell us in the same way that as the kind of banking system took shape in the US and there was a search to figure out what the language should be for banking, how do we express the things that banks are supposed to express? Could that also be here? There wouldn't necessarily be the kind of greenhouse volume on a big box kind of language, but something else that's that speaks to that. And I think you're starting to in the kind of complex section you're developing. But for me, I think this is a really fascinating piece of the project, and I think it's one that takes some work to kind of get our heads around when we think of data in this way. So I appreciate that you're bringing that to the table here.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on that because I think it's interesting. It's like if you're thinking, is it the Department of Public Works now is the Department of Public Data or something? So is it something that the city itself is running it? And then that also begins to create some incentives because it might be cheaper to grow the food because you're using the heat from someplace. So it's like there's something there about who's running this and what is public, and mostly because you're also adding the idea of the library. It's like, is this part of when you do the library, you attach all these other things, but it's part of a municipal thing, and what does that do to the city? So I think the logistical aspect of that, I think it can, is it a cooperative? Is it something else? Like what is the organization that and who benefits? I mean, you're removing the data from that, but it's like who do you think these improvements are going to benefit? Is it another company that is running this building? Is it something shared through people? The other aspect that I'd like to know more is maybe just the kind of like the aesthetics of your building a little bit, like the, you know, when we see the section, there's kind of like the rooftop of production of food, it still picks up on the idea of the greenhouse, the typology of the greenhouse. But is there any other aesthetic that you're exploring because of the intersection of all the three different programs?
Well, definitely like the so like in this Zoom in, like these established reading rooms, they were kind of designed so that when people are in the space, they're seeing like everything out around them. So I guess the reading rooms were like designed specifically to experience like the greenhouse around them, while not disturbing the greenhouse as much as possible. That's like one immediate thing.
Can I ask a clarification? I'm sorry, I there was a lot of your movie that I wasn't able to understand completely, and I was still in the middle of watching and stuff. But maybe you might have talked about this. But the fruit shapes I'm looking at your website on the drawings section.
Mm-hmm.
If you scrolling down to the exploded axon, there's these kind of pear shapes and fruit shapes. Is that meant to be legible, like from within the reading rooms? Is that, I don't know, like, maybe I covered this, but maybe I missed this.
So like within the reading rooms, no, because they're like larger spaces. But if you're like looking through at the greenhouse, yes. Yeah, but they're meant to be pretty figurative.
Who is the audience for the figures? You know, like, is it, I mean, I like them because it reminds me of those, like, you know, moments of a website where you have to demonstrate that you're not a robot, where you like, you know, it would be like, choose which shapes have fruit in them. And so I was just thinking, if, you know, part of this story is about withdrawing from the kind of data circulation regimes, you know, to what extent could you think about that as being part of that story? You know, can the building itself perform that process of like being unseeable or undatafiable? And is there something where you know, this is kind of navigating that line? I mean, maybe I'm extrapolating, but I mean, I do think that there's something about that, the question of audience, that I think is so interesting at that scale of the roof. You know, if you're seeing these from the aerial view, is that like an automated eye? Is that a surveillance system? You know, who is looking at them from above? And to what end? And so I do think, again, that there's a possibility of kind of elaborating or, you know, and intensifying the aesthetic exploration through the premise of the institution, which is, again, like super compelling.
Definitely. I think that's like a really interesting conversation, actually. But it kind of begins to like, when these figures start to spill out into the front, that's when I think visitors get that first exploration of that. But definitely, like, who is the audience for like the center?
Yeah, I think what I want to emphasize about your project is its capacity to generate new paradigms or new questions about architecture. So in that sense, for instance, it is very clear that your building is embedded in a series of processes of production and consumption. And that's, you know, if in the previous project we were fascinated by this endless, you know, or closed circuit and interior, in yours you are negotiating all the time how the interior and the exterior and the city, the building and the city relate to each other. And you as an architect were deciding how much energy goes to this part of the city or this other part. So I think that's also beautiful to understand how questions about energy and data and, you know, how these forms of distribution are part of the role of the architect, or when we design architecture that are part of what we do. So that's one thing. And the other is also this clash of programs between production and, you know, this cultural program that is also immaterial production, and how these two are able to be together in this building and obviously differ very much from what one imagine about the modern city where the centers of production and there's a set of culture were completely separated. So the fact that you merge these two, sometimes you explain it almost as a kind of aesthetic question, that you are enjoying the production of the tomatoes while you are reading a book. But at the same time, these two economies are able to be together because, you know, the form of the capitalist production and the ways in which, you know, architecture has been operating in the last decades made that possible. So I think that within its simplicity, I think there are certain paradigms that are really at the center of what you do, and are things that you can work with in the next years, probably. So I find it really interesting.
Yeah, maybe just really quickly, again, I think it's a fascinating project. To me, once you introduce the library, the program of the library, it becomes essential to also articulate what the library gains by being nested in this kind of conglomerate, new kind of conglomerate. And to me, that's not quite clear yet. But I think maybe what Jesse was pointing out, I think could be really productive for you to think more about. Of course, you know, when Jesse was talking about a new form of banking, I was thinking of Otto Wagner's Postal Savings Bank, and the kind of transformation that building made in terms of expressing what currency exchange meant, or the change that was happening to currency exchange at that time, and that was no longer the kind of, you know, the bulwark or the kind of castle behind which the money was safe, but it was transparent and it was open in order to articulate that there was a new kind of transaction logistics happening. And so I guess once you set the library in that new relationship, one would think that the form of the library changes, or ideally it would change and it would produce something different. And so I wonder, even though I like the formal repercussions of it, or I guess I'm saying, like, I'm not quite sure if they are repercussions yet, or if they're sort of simply in invented form, and both is fine. I just think it would be good to position yourself and to say, or to articulate, or try to articulate what the form contributes, the form of the library, but also maybe what the two other programs contribute to the rethinking of the library that is sort of the pear shape currently. I think that's where to me the kind of richness of the project lies, and that's where I hope you could maybe think a bit more about it and just articulate. Maybe it doesn't even need a kind of redesign, but kind of an articulation of that adjacency and what it produces, especially for the library, I think would be important, because you make that additional program, and how it exactly works is sort of a question mark for me.
I just have a super quick comment that may be on a slightly different track. I appreciate the clarity of your drawings, and the section drawing in particular is something that I think is very fascinating. I don't actually know a whole lot about greenhouse farming and growing, and what actually is needed, and what the kind of issues and kind of resistances are in this. Like, obviously with, like, you know, outdoor farming, there's things like pests, or so-called pests, or you know, pesticides, and those kinds of things are highly controlled, of course, in this kind of situation. But part of me is also wondering, maybe because there's something that's been on my mind recently, is whether there's a kind of confluence of something between the greenhouse and the libraries that could be shared, and a confluence of not confluence, sorry, an overlap of I don't know, program or something that can be shared, perhaps aside from the kind of energy or heat exchange. And something that came to mind is the use of bats in a library in Portugal to basically get rid of the insects that are, like, eating away at books. And part of me, then I started thinking, well, I wonder if because in outdoor farms, bats are actually very useful too. And I don't know if that's something that would be useful for your greenhouse, but maybe there's in terms of the section, maybe there's a kind of thickened section between your greenhouse and the library below that becomes a kind of like bat zone or something. But that's just me fantasizing. So
you
I like that.
Brilliant, Joyce. Joyce is like, yeah, the bat expert. I like that maybe that just kind of exemplifies Alexander's comment that there would be something innovative shared between the two, and that is then architectural. And so that's kind of a great. Fascinating comments. I'm going to move on because I know some of our jury are going to shift soon. Madison, thanks so very much. And I'm going to see the comments here.
Yeah, I can share my screen.
So just whoever has to leave, just leave, and there's some other people coming. So we'll just do a kind of seamless switch over. I'm not going to sort of stop the program. Thanks.
Can you see my screen, right?
We can see the website. Yes, we can.
Yeah, okay. So I'll go ahead and play the narrative movie. Just stop me if you don't hear the sound properly.
Daphne opened her eyes gently, listening to the loud chatter of seahawks. She glanced at her bedside window. The sun was peeking on the horizon. The endless ripples of the ocean caught Daphne's attention as it was constantly moving the floating buoys on the water surface. I hope they're okay, she thought, and immediately grabbed her phone to check the status of her kelp farm that is all underwater. She was pleased with the sensors installed in the long lines of her kelp farm that inform her about its well-being. Later, a boat arrived at the platform, carrying loads of harvested kelp. The crane in the platform was transferring the harvest from the boat to the platform. The freshly harvested kelp looked slimy, green, and glistened with sunlight. Did they harvest it already? She thought to herself, while she knew that her kelp farm might take a week or two until it's ready. The fishing boat caught her attention on the boat deck. It was attached with a robotic arm that was automatically detecting the kelp lines and pulling it out of water effortlessly. The drying racks were filled with freshly harvested kelp, being dried with heat from the underwater data centers. Daphne cannot wait to get her harvest to the drying deck, where it becomes 10 times less heavy and can be shipped off to the land easily. In the evening, the platforms were filled with spring harvest, and the smell of fresh kelp filled the soft breeze that touched her skin on the walkway connecting the modules. Later that night, she enjoyed a quiet dinner on her deck outdoors. The familiar warmth of the data furnace kept her comfortable. She sipped on her kelp cocktail, listening to the gentle noise of the northern wind and admiring Clue Bay's spectacular sunset, glowing up the kelp farm, stretching wide across the ocean.
Yeah, now I'll go ahead and explain the details of the project. So floating modules is about data and kelp farms. So the floating modules is made out of like these three systems. Number one, the data cylinders, which use the ocean as a resource to cool the surface. And secondly, the kelp lines, which absorb the excess carbon that is that is emitted by the data cylinders. And three, the living units, which provide the necessary infrastructure and housing for the farmers to live in. So these three systems combine into these modules, And these modules in turn combine as a cluster, like having this relationship of part to whole. As I mentioned earlier, floating modules is about like farming these coastal grown commodities like sea kelp, sea cucumber, and sea abalone. Sea kelp is a highly nutritious macroalgae, and it thrives in a marine environment, and it can be made into cattle fodder, and it can be made into biofuel, and it can also be converted into various human consumables like noodles and pasta. Sea cucumber and sea abalone are majorly grown for food consumption because they are like highly nutrient dense, while the sea cucumber is sourced for like supplements as it is a main ingredient for supplement, and sea abalone is a type of shellfish, and the outer shell of abalone is used for making ornaments. The community grows these three commodities because of the symbiosis they share with each other, and they are beneficial to each other. So kelp has this, so the kelp farming has this temporality going on because it's a winter crop and it is essentially grown from late September to March. And it also requires like extensive, it has to be taken care from like extracting the sporophytes from the mature kelp, and it has to be grown under controlled conditions in a laboratory, and then it is deployed in the long lines. Since kelp farming occurs only during the winter, so the community plays out a different role in the summer, which can become like a facility for ecotourists and like also learning about kelp. Meanwhile, the sea cucumber and abalone can be grown throughout the year, and it is like hung off of the same long lines of the kelp. So the data focus of the project is distributed data centers rather than like a hyperscale data center that occupies a lot of land and emits tons of carbon with the waste heat. So this diagram explains the input and output of the data center. So the input energy for the data center is provided by offshore wind farms, while the beneficial output from the data center like electricity and Wi-Fi are like utilized by the housing units. Meanwhile, the waste byproducts like high carbon content and heat are like assimilated by the kelp, as if the kelp is a natural carbon sink. So moving on to the site plan. So the site is in the west coast of Ireland, which already has like a very small scale seaweed farms that are occurring, that are like there now in like coastal regions, close to the coast. And the project also utilizes the existing data infrastructure of the optic fiber cables that is landing onto the west coast of Ireland. As you can see, the red line is the data cable that is like landing onto the west coast. And as you can see, the linear clusters are the floating communities, and the wind farms that you see play out like the location and the proximity of the wind farms sort of decide like how the clusters can grow. And as it is like there is like a minimum proximal distance that has to be required from the living units to the offshore wind farms. And this is a zoomed in image of the clusters. So as you can see, the linear, the small squares are the living units, and the kelp farms like extend horizontally like beside the modules. So taking a closer look at one of those clusters, so the modules aggregate into clusters and then they extend from different access points along the coastline, as you saw. So as we have seen earlier, the modules are staggered and they are connected with a walkway running as a spine, which can be connected to the shoreline based on its proximity. So the farther end of the modules have these kelp lines extending horizontally. So the image shows the shows the farm. The black dots are the floating views from which the long lines are supported. So these long lines holds the kelp farm underwater. So as we zoom into the design of one of these modules, the platform close to the kelp farms are designed to manage several tons of kelp during seeding and harvest. And the module is made up of two parts. The upper part, which consists of living and recreation spaces, and the lower part where it is an out and out production space, and it has private labs and a collective working space. The step platform on the top connects the module to the boat deck below, and it also connects the walkway to the farmer cottages. The deck also has these data furnaces outdoor, and it also has some seaweed soaks. So this is an exploded image showing the parts of the project. So the platforms below have these data cylinders that are attached to the bottom surface, and they are essentially underwater. And the lower part of the module has these drying racks and also private lab spaces and a collective workspace surrounding it and a boat deck beside it. And the upper part of the lower lab and the upper housing units are connected through staircase, which the residents can gain a private access to the lab and to the housing unit above. And also, as you can see, the platforms are beside the farms and which manage them.
I'm going to give you 2 minutes, Siva, because okay. I know Joyce is a hard out at 11:30, and I want her to kind of have a couple of comments before she leaves. Okay.
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
So the housing units are staggered to each other to give maximum privacy, and it maximizes the view for each of the housing units towards the ocean. And this is a floor plan of the deck, which again, the windows and doors do not open onto the housing units, and they maximize the views as much as possible to the farms and the ocean. And the plan of the lower level, which has private labs and collective working space. And this is a zoomed in image of the lower level and the upper level. Yeah, and the section shows how the modules is embedded into the cross section of Clue Bay. As when you can zoom in, you can see two modules next to each other, and the sort of relationship they share with the kelp farms, and the kelp farms suspending from long lines and with floating buoys on the top. And this is again a zoomed in image of one of these modules, and it shows the formal arrangement of the house are designed in a way to maximize the views and extending the views up to the ocean. And the drying rack here sort of it is supplied by heat from these underwater data centers, which are helps in drying the kelp. And the deck above is where the recreation and the spaces occur there. And these are zoomed in plans and sections of the housing typologies there. So the number one is a cottage typology, which has upper and lower levels, and they are provided with these data furnaces, which supply heat from these underwater data centers to above. And again, and the floor plans of these typologies. And it also, the bottom floor also has this lab where these spools of baby kelp grow in an aquaria, and they need to have very controlled conditions of lighting and temperature for them to grow. And moving on to the renders. So the renders sort of give this surreal quality of Irish coastline, where it is very misty, foggy, and how the project sort of expresses those qualities. And this is the image of one of the modules looking at the drying rack and the other architectural features. The zoom in image of the boat and then the drying rack. And this is the walkway that is connecting the modules. And this is again image from the movie that expresses the surreal quality of the atmosphere that it is in. So the metrics of the project is like simple. It discusses architecture, the data, the energy, and the kelp lines. So as you can see, like each module like has 2.5% capacity of a land-based data center, and the amount of windmills that requires to power those data centers, and the amount of kelp farms that it can occupy, and also the amount of protein like each module can produce in comparison with the cattle industry. So these clusters like aggregate into module, and like each cluster can produce about 670 protein content of like 670 cows. So when you compare the statistics with the cattle industry in Ireland, it's like it has 7.2 million cows, which is like 0.01%. And then so if you want to expand, if you want to replace the cattle industry with these kelp farms, so you need space like in the ocean, like which is almost 2 times the size of Ireland, which is like 40 million acres. So yeah, that's that.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's it for the project.
Thanks, Eva. I'm just going to let Joyce, if Joyce is still there, make the first comment, because I know Joyce has a class to go to.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you,
Claire. No, I absolutely love your project, and this last part about the comparison of the cows just so much reminds me of the kind of Pig City reference for MVRTV and so on. I think it's really brilliant. The scale of the project is it's something I'm still kind of grappling with. I was looking kept looking at your site axon drawing to try to even understand like what kind of scale we're looking at, and I think the kind of how mapping they did at the end really sort of helped help me sort of realize like how big this actually could be. So I think there's something quite radical potentially about this entire proposal that but at the same time, I love how the movie is something that makes this all seem very like domestic, and there's this kind of comfortable, almost like I don't know, like this idea of like kelp cocktail and all these things is just, you know, there's a kind of familiarity and a comfort, almost like comfort with the film that you're producing. And I think the thing I would probably just maybe, there's just a lot to talk about, but the thing I would maybe just kind of, that I think would be interesting to kind of work to explore a little bit further is just how you even think about like living on the water and what your housing and buildings might actually look like. Because right now, when you got to the part where we're looking at the sections and plans of the buildings, I for a moment forgot that you were on the water. I was like, oh, this is like a conventional, like, so what would be a way that you reimagine living and being in this kind of situation? So yeah, but thank you, really, really great work. Beautiful drawings.
Thank you.
I'm going to give Alexander the next, sorry, it's like kind of getting tickets because he's running to an executive committee meeting. And after that, we're like, have a much more relaxed conversation.
Well, thank you, everybody. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks.
Nice to see you, Joyce. Thanks, Claire. Yeah, just quickly, the heat from the servers, you sort of at the beginning you alluded to it, that they're sort of heating up the water, and only at the end I think you were saying that that helps to dry the kelp, right? And so I guess I'm sort of trying to figure out the technology, even though we were of course tasked by not thinking maybe too deeply about it, but it's I think you want to make sure that you're not suggesting that you're heating up the ocean. And so with that, which would be a kind of a consequence, but that you would make the argument that that's actually not happening, but that somehow with that heat, it is actually enabling the kelp farming. And so maybe there is a kind of architectural device that maybe blocks of the ocean water or some, yeah, I mean, unless I'm misunderstanding that that's actually right, but that could be a kind of unintended consequences, right? The heating of the ocean.
So actually, like, it actually doesn't heat the ocean because the excess heat is used by the modules in order to heat the housing units there. It doesn't actually heat up the ocean, but to some extent, because like these data servers are always cooled extensively, and they use a lot of energy for cooling these data centers. The thing that I was intending to say was like the reason that it is underwater, I mean, it could also like use the ocean as a resource to cool the servers because like
but I think that's where the problem lies, right? Because once you say that the servers are going to be cooled by the ocean, that means that the ocean will warm up. And I think I guess one could say that it's neglectable, like that it's such a small amount. But I guess like especially with projects like this, I think you want to make sure that the consequences are intended rather than unintended. But otherwise, I think I like the kind of scenarios that you're playing up, and I'm especially intrigued by the view of the farmer, looking out and checking in. And but when I saw that perspective, I imagined 100 other workers to have that same scenario. And I guess while I like the kind of view of the individual house, I wonder if if you could suggest that there are actually more jobs and more workers for whom you would build a kind of also a kind of housing urbanism around that agrarian urbanism that you're already setting up, in which that might compare, maybe not in terms of the scale of the farm itself that doubles Ireland, but that maybe becomes a kind of linear city along the edge of that large ocean farm, so that it's not kind of the individual. Because right now it feels a little bit like this is the kind of this woman is the owner of the farm, and then the kind of minions sort of running around. And I wonder if there is something where you could think of the collective as something that produces also an architectural form along the coast. But great project, and thanks for having me, Claire. Great to see you, Jesse. Sorry for needing to run.
Talk soon.
See you soon, I hope.
Yeah, maybe I think I have similar questions as Alexander about the effect of this. Yeah, I understand these are the typical, like the prototype of Microsoft did for these underwater data centers that are extremely fascinating, and indeed they use the temperature of the ocean to mitigate, the excess of cooling that is needed. So I think that indeed serves to require less electricity to cool the system because the water operates in that way. But in exchange, there is an exchange, and the water gets warmer. And then obviously we were talking before about byproducts. There are byproducts associated with that could be other species that suddenly will be attracted to that area, and others that will be displaced. So I think there is an interesting ecosystem that will be triggered by the introduction of that technology. So, but I mean, obviously these questions are complicated, and none of us control it fully. But I think it's beautiful because all the projects understands these different technologies and the territory associated at different forms of living, whether it is the kelp and these other species and the humans and so on. So as it gets more complicated, so it will gain more knowledge about the real effects of these technologies, then these relations will also get a bit more complicated, and therefore the architectures that are generated around it. So that's what I was confused when you were saying that the kelp will be dried with the energy of the data centers, because I was like, well, but that will be dissipated in the ocean. How do you channel the temperature in the form of air to the surface? That indeed requires much more, kind of another extra system for which the data center is not designed. It's precisely designed to be cooled by the ocean and then dissipates the the heat in the ocean as well. But in any case, I think that is a super interesting project. And I think the way in which you have analyzed these different elements, how they affect each other, and how they operate in that particular territory, I think is beautiful. And somehow, even though that generally I'm terrified about these, hyper infrastructural spaces, you managed to create something like I was even, I don't know, interesting aesthetic quality. I think your images and these kind of sunsets even convinced me that there will be a beautiful space to live. So I guess that is something. So congratulations on the work. Yeah.
For me, I mean, it's. I'll just quickly add that I think that the acknowledgement of the kind of labor that's going on here is significant. I mean, I think one thing that I think is challenging about the project, as people have said already, it puts a lot of pressure on this particular technology of the data module as a kind of alibi for the project. And so I think that's one of the things for me, I would be interested in thinking about how that becomes a more indispensable and clearer part of the project that's more than just the kind of I guess that's the premise of like how these things get intertwined. And so I think that's one piece. And then I think the other, just maybe to extend on what Marina and Alexander are saying, I do think that there's a little bit of a blind spot in the project around the premise of living on the farm. And I'd be interested because I guess I'm wondering how you might bring that need out more. It happens that I've been spending the year of remote COVID on a remote agricultural island, and am not at all related to that, professionally, but have been interesting to live within the community. And there's the role of seasonality and the role of community are both really key. And so, the reason that you live on a farm, in my understanding, is that you need to be there all the time. But in this case, you're talking about kind of remote sensing, you're talking about being able to check on the crops. And then there's a kind of like you work in the daytime when you can see what you're doing. And so I guess I'm just wondering how you think about the urbanism that's being applied here, and what the role of kind of living offshore would be. And because right now it seems like as Marina's saying it, and Joyce too, it feels like it's kind of like cool hotel almost, but then really it's kind of like this is people's like livelihood, like this is how you're surviving. And so, where do you get groceries, and like, where do your kids go to school, and like all that kind of urbanistic stuff, which is not to say that that's something you should have been doing, but it's just to say I really appreciate the project because it's raising these questions about, what are different forms of labor and production, and what does that mean to the adjacent city. I'm just thinking of like the cities shown here on the map as dots. And it's interesting because like the dots are even like smaller than the thing you've designed. And so, I just like, even just to show the kind of figure ground of the adjacent towns relative to these docks would be like really exciting, I think, because you'd start to see potentially relationships between systems. We know that implied in the drawing like this is that like the level of this ocean is changing, and so the coastline is changing. All these things that you're raising are also so fascinating. And so I think that one thing that could be worth should you continue to explore it, and I hope you would, because I think that there's so many compelling connections. But one would be to add another metric that I think would be the kind of Euro value of this kind of stuff, because I think that's partly where a lot of these things turn. Like, so for example, the where I am, it's a lobster fishery, but there's been a lot of pressure on reducing the amount, and so scallop aquaculture has become a big part of the story. But that a lot of that is around the kind of financial sensibility of that it's like a really effective and efficient crop, so to speak. And so I'm just thinking like, how do you sort of talk about kelp not in terms of the kind of environmental ecological footprint of it, but the actual like financial footprint of it, like how does this become a proposition, as a form of livelihood, as an alternative to whatever it is that these people might be doing. And I think that's just to say that you're opening up onto some, I think, really fascinating questions about how economic, labor, urbanism all intertwine, and how they're transforming, in front of us. And you're accelerating that a little bit so that we can anticipate it, but in the way that exactly these studios should be doing, I think. So I totally appreciate the project, and I think that it's and I think it's great that it raises all these questions. But I think there's also lots to figure out still. But thank you for sharing it.
Thank you.
Yeah, but just follow up the same thing. Is just it's a great project. It's been a great conversation about from the technological aspects, but also like what it means to live on the water. There is something that is a quality of almost like the person who lives there is like the lighthouse. Like I live on my own, and I'm like the solitary person. And then there's like between the building is a little bit of more like sea ranch type of community, but then there's like the whole other scale of production. So kind of like following up what everybody has said about like who lives here, what it entails to be here. Like, do you live here if you work here? And it's kind of like a more like a planned industrial community, and there's a whole set of rules that are like related to the farm, or do you live outside here and you come temporary? Just kind of like thinking about that, I think is going to help to understand really like how the community works, and also like where do you make the decision of putting this in the ocean? Like what are the requirements on the land? Do you need to be close to another city? Do you need to build another city? I mean, just kind of like all these things, like I think is going to help to understand a little bit more about what it means to be there. Is it enticing, or is it just because it's a production area? Like, would I want to live there even if I have nothing to do with it? Or do I just go there because that's my business and I need to live there all the time? So, but kind of like all great projects, all of them.
Okay, Siva, thanks ever so much. And thanks for all your hard work over the last 9 months, as the same to Madison and Hafsa. I know that we're on a little bit of a shift here. I'd like to welcome Charles Waldheim. Charles, thank you for coming. Johnny Irving, Professor of Landscape Architecture at the GSD and Director of the Office of Urbanization there. And Charles, like Marina, was also one of the jurors for the competition. And so again, it's great to have you back to see how we're fulfilling some of the ambitions of the proposal as it was written.
Thanks, Claire. It's nice to be here. Hi, Marina. Hi, Jesse.
Jesse and Marina. Jesse, I know you wanted to take 2 or 3 minutes out. Marina, how are you doing? Do you want to keep going? Jesse, I mean, feel free to step out.
Oh yeah, that's fine. Why don't we just keep going? I'll be okay.
Yeah, okay, all right. I am kind of conscious also too, because you have a hard out even maybe by 12:50 or whatever. So I think we'll plow on. There's only, good, 3, there's less jurors. And so the conversation might be a little bit more fluid and will speed up as a result too. Okay, Charles, you missed the introduction, but the website link is there if you want to look through the website in tandem. That was the kind of logic of having students present that way. So we'll plow
I've seen it, and yeah, it looks fantastic. I mean, congratulations.
Well, it's kind of the beta version. We're still have a little bit to do. So Fernando, am I correct in thinking that you're up next?
Yeah, I'm up next.
Okay, it's all yours.
Alrighty, I'll share my screen. Project's name is Data Wall Farms. So if you cannot hear the audio, please stop me. Hi, are you the trainee engineer? I'm the data engineer. I've been working here for 4 years now. I've been asked to give you a tour of this zone. This is section B of the fruit data farm. This is where I start my walk every day. We are currently between wall 14 and 15, which is a greenhouse where microgreens like radish are grown. Still amazes me to glance down and see the length of the wall extending to the horizon. There are 1.5 acres of agriculture here.
How long is the wall?
Each wall is different. Some extend up to almost half a mile, while others only about 1/8 of a mile. Most are in between. Also, community volunteers take care of the vegetation in this greenhouse.
Why is it so hot in here?
Well, the heat is coming from servers on the other side of this wall. It is recycled and used to warm the walls and the space in between. It's actually a very old cycle from the 1600s. Also, if you listen closely, you can hear the airflow. The first server on our list is right around the corner. I know the space is tight, but you'll be on your own next time, so it's enough space just for you.
How many servers are in this hall?
In section B, wall 15, there are 200 server racks just like this one. That's 8 1,000 servers because each rack can hold up to 40 dedicated servers. Alright, now let's head over to wall 16 for a quick check.
What is this space?
On the left, we have a glass house growing a tropical type of orange, the mandarin. It needs a lot of heat because it's native to Southeastern Asia and the Philippines. Then outside we have some carrots growing. The fruit grown on the walls uses the espalier technique, which is a process of training trees against a flat surface. This is wall 16. Make sure you read the map correctly before going to the north or the south portion of the wall. It's like a labyrinth here, and sometimes I get lost. So you know, the server racks are on a set of wheels, so they're able to be pulled out. We are now going to the last wall in the zone through the tennis courts on wall 17. We can take the public access because it looks like no one's using the south court. Before we go in, passing wall 17 is a pool. The one on the north end is 2.5 feet deep, while the south end is 5 feet deep. Now to the last server at the end of this hall. Yeah, so this project looks at the productive overlap of agriculture and data topologies. For example, Yahoo designed a data center to resemble the Cape Codder chicken coop, which we'll see in a little bit, because it allows free flow of ventilation and decreases energy consumption. This is going to be a analysis on fruit walls, which my project takes a lot of influence from. These fruit walls were in agricultural typologies, highly used by the French and English from the 1600s to the late 1800s. These fruit walls would capture heat from the sun and then release that thermal energy at night to create a microclimate that supported fruits and vegetables that were not native to the area. And then the English further developed this design by placing chimneys and furnaces into the wall, and then later on ran heated water pipes to better control the microclimate that was created. In my project, I chose a variety of different fruits and vegetables that range in heat that's required to grow them, just in case, or just to help situate them, whether they're going in the glass house or in the space between the walls. And then lastly, for the data diagrams on this page, instead of having this larger data center that causes deforestation in rural areas, I am distributing that same size in various different ways to allow more of the context to stay in place. And then in this diagram, we have the the chicken coop that Yahoo redesigned for a data center to allow the free flow of ventilation. And then lastly, my last concept is transparency, because I believe that a lot of these corporations manipulate the way that the public sees data centers. And then moving on to the site of the project is a small rural town in Ireland called Athenry. This originally was Apple was originally proposing a data center in Athenry, but the people of the town protested it since it's really bad for the environment. So I wanted to propose a different version of that data center. So when reconfiguring this 1 million square foot data center, I divided it into different lengths of lines depending on whether servers are stacked or not. So we get 40 miles, 10 miles, 20-mile different configurations. And then these configurations were overlaid on the site to see how it interacts with the site. And then lastly, this is the final product of that, taking influences from each one. So moving on to the drawing, as we can see the site plan, the in green is the farming agriculture data centers. So these spaces surrounding the town. And then from this, I plan to divide up the ownership of the land that's used to farm. So near residential homes, they're given their own piece of land to garden. And then in the darker blue, we have town-owned gardens. And then in the lighter blue and the screen on top, that's given to farmers that require a lot more acreage. And then within this, I have divided up the agriculture that's grown due to orientations of the wall. And then lastly, we have a recreational and storage diagram to show where in orange, for example, these basketball courts, where they're placed near the town. And then we move on to the next set of drawings, which are the Exonometrics. Here we have starting to zoom in to get more of an idea of how these data centers, data walls are in place in the town. And we can see that the buildings are still higher than the walls because the walls are only 10 feet. Into this one, we get to see how there's going to be agriculture in between the walls. And then this is a close-up zoom in from using some of the programs from the video that we saw. So in certain areas, we're going to have this is an example of having dragon fruits in this section, and then also including some of the different programs like a glass house, a half glass house, tennis courts, and a pool. This is just a plan overview of that to see how this kind of works, how there's just rows of data servers. And then we have some more larger sections of that. So the way it works is that we're going to be having cold air flow in through vents from the bottom, and then that cold air will be used by the data servers, and then the heat exhaust will be going into a heat transfer into pipes, water pipes, and then this water pipe would run through the wall to help keep a even temperature for the wall, depending on what fruit is grown on the wall or near the wall, and then the excess heat would be distributed outside, upward. And then we have some renders from the video to get a little bit more idea of how each space looks and how different programs could be integrated within this project. And then lastly, this is a metrics of the agriculture that's grown. So one figure is equivalent to 10,000 people. So we can see how radish can feed up to 5.2 million people. And then the same area for pomegranates will only feed up to 100,000 people. But lastly, I just wanted to leave you guys with this thought that we all use data, whether it's scrolling through Facebook or saving our Google Doc essays. And a lot of people believe that we don't, that data is this massless type of object, but in reality, it's physical matter. So this project really just shows how much a 1 million square foot data center could be taking over the city with these data fruit walls. And that is my project.
Thanks, Fernando.
Thanks, Fernando. That's a lot of radish. You say radish or radishes?
There's multiple radish. So
yeah.
I would type in radishes, but it would
if I had 2 or 3 radishes, I would pluralize them. But once you get to this tonnage, I'm thinking radish is probably the way to go. Fantastic. I love this thing. I've got 2 questions and they're naive because I just joined and I'm sorry about that, but maybe these are outside the scope of what you're onto. The first is simple. Where is the energy coming from that fuel the existing data farms on the periphery of the city? And is that the same source that would fuel your data farm? And then secondly, if you could just clarify the orientation of the walls relative to north-south.
Yeah, so I can show this image. So north would be up here, and then each wall is subdivided with the roads to change the orientation, and each orientation can allow for like different fruits to have more of the sunlight directly on it, which causes more heat. For energy production, I have not followed up with that for this. One idea was that there could be land given to wind farms that can help produce the energy for these servers, but that's still under consideration.
And it's perfectly reasonable to say that the source of the energy may be outside the scope of the studio or your particular project. But I quite like first of all, it's a very literate project. You've done quite a lot of research looking at these agricultural techniques, let's call them. In selecting fruit, you've also found a fairly high value added product that has a lot of value to it. And if you mix into that, you know, the kinds of other things that you're describing, I quite like this image of this kind of enfilade maze. Can you explain to me the, you know, the tennis courts and the pool? They look lovely. Are they meant for employees? Is this a public amenity? Can I go there as a tourist if I live nearby, or is it only for the worker bees?
No, so the idea is that it's given to the public to kind of help push this idea of a data center on Athenry, since they once denied the project. So there's multiple benefits for residents that live here as well, like having their own space for gardening. But
Interesting, yeah.
there
And
is
are
public
those
access for these.
courts and pools always at the end of the enfilade series, or it looks like here sometimes they're intermixed?
Yeah, so I tried to keep the courts and pools near an access point, which would be like a road, just so it's easier access for the public.
Well, as I say, I mean, I find it, I find the premise of it intoxicating and well researched. I think it's a lovely image. So on the one hand, I apologize if you guys have been through this in the morning already, but so the, you know, the data center is a kind of thermal math problem of sorts, right? So on the one hand, they're meant to be placed where land, you know, is not a problem. There's plenty of land. And it's about the dissipation of heat relative to volume. And so the stacking or the horizontal organization of those produces a kind of thermal, you know, kind of math problem that's interesting. By distributing them, I guess what I find interesting would be to think about how that kind of thermodynamic feedback loop, this section is great, yeah, let's park there, how that thermodynamic feedback loop can be induced to move the heat in such a way so as to make the fruit available to it without additional mechanical means. And in that, what I would like to study further would be the kind of, you know, the space of the server racks, and to what extent you need to like separately chimney or duct or valence that. So on the one hand, I'm most interested in the project if we can make the server rack themselves the architectural element. And in that, my kind of simplistic way of approaching this would be to think about the heat generated from the servers in combination with the thermal absorption from the sun. Now, obviously, the heat from the servers may in fact have, you know, a much bigger magnitude, but I wouldn't sleep on the actual solar performance here as well. And so in that regard, it's not clear to me that the orientation of various orientations is the way to go. I mean, I think on the one hand, that's a nice image with respect to existing uses and existing land, et cetera. But I'm actually taken in the video of this just kind of ruthless enfilade series of rooms. And I would try to tune the orientation of those relative to solar performance so as to produce both shade, excess heat, et cetera. In that regard, I was intrigued in places where you had like a partial greenhouse around the orangery, other places that were more open. And for me, the project gets really most interesting in the diversity of those different conditions. In that sense, I suppose one would want to have more thermal mass. My guess is both for solar performance, but also based on the servers themselves, because the servers are producing a certain amount of heat energy all the time. And you may want to be able to store that to then redistribute it in times when you have more cloud cover or during the winter, this kind of thing. So I wouldn't want you to actually battery store that. I think it's a thermal architectonic problem. But the idea of having a thicker kind of trom wall, it's also interesting to think about where you could open that. So one question I've got, Fernando, is like, is there a thermal envelope? Is there a humidity envelope around the server? I would imagine you don't want your servers to get wet, which is why you have doors and windows and these kinds of things. But given that, I wonder if we might be able to play with the kind of plasticity of that a little bit more, because for me, it's most compelling when you get these different sectional conditions. And then the last thing I would say is perhaps in addition to intermixed within the productive space, let's say this industrial space, I wonder if the ends might be the more public venue. So as opposed to needing to bring the public through the industrial space, if you might be able to use the ends that are more open to the site, you know, to be able to enter and use them without going through the enfilade series of strips. But it's a really fascinating proposition. Thanks for sharing it with us.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think Charles put on the table the questions that I had, and I had the same issue about the orientation and also the light, how the incidence of the sun will have a role in the shade that also those walls would project. And indeed, I was thinking why, I mean, there is something ruthless about this project, but at the same time, I live in the Netherlands that this project is totally feasible, you know, it's almost already planned in the Westlands. I was thinking what it will happen if suddenly this Cartesian rectangular and its orientation will be broken by some diagonal and other ways of circulating in that space. So what is the benefit of adjusting the orientation of these lines to the existing roads, and not to be much more radical in a way and select just like one direction and then play with. But that's, I think, is also not only formal games. I think there is many conditions connected to that. So that was one question, orientation, and the other was scale, because what I was asking myself is like there seems to me that some of the spaces are very empty. Like, for instance, to be places of growing vegetables, you could see a lot of space between the tables where the vegetables are. So the only place that seems, or the only two places that seem to be at their scale is the server and the court, the tennis court, because they are responding to a very particular norm, I will say. But then is that you are modulating these spaces around those ones. And then I will say, what is the proper size of a swimming pool? And how can it be, like, what will happen if we will narrow it down to the minimum? What other conditions will emerge if suddenly we operate through scale, like a density, that suddenly the densities that we have in that spaces vary to the point that suddenly, you know, a swimming pool is as narrow as a server rack. And then what type of activities will happen? So it seems to me that there is potential also in rethinking those spaces through the space between the servers and the density they produce in relation to the programs. And suddenly there will be like, you know, very unexpected conditions happening there. And indeed, then they will have to, again, be connected to the type of like sun and shadows that will create it through the walls, what we were discussing with Charles about the relation between the temperature and how the air is going in and out. So, you know, all these things come together in relation to this length and these densities as well. So I see room to continue working in this project and sell it to the kingdom of the Netherlands maybe in a few years.
Yeah, I love that idea. For me, I mean, there's so much to appreciate in this project, and I think that I think it's fantastic that we can talk about a project like this at the scale of the server detail or at the territorial scale, and that you've brought us through all this. And I think that the opening premise, this kind of sleight of hand that says, you know, did you know that in a 1 million square foot warehouse there's actually 40 or linear miles of server rack shelving? That already is an incredible premise for a foundation of a project. I mean, I do find there's some humor to it that I think is also really great. Like, on one hand, the tour as the structure for the video. There's a great, you may have seen it, a fantastic episode of Undercover Boss inside a distribution center that's very much in the spirit that I recommend. But then also the humor to my mind that I keep kind of cracking up about is that, you know, the idea that Apple was sort of booed out of town, and then you're coming back and saying, well, if you didn't like that one, try this on for size. You know, we're going to reorganize the whole thing. But I think that's where there's something really exciting, because you actually say, you know, look, we take this seriously now as a kind of parceling economic premise. And so, to my mind, I mean, some of just like old-fashioned urbanism territory questions would be super interesting to think about here. Like, where do, like, what would be the phasing for this? Like, where would you start, and how does that sort of get, how does it roll out agriculturally? How do you start thinking about it in terms of cycles and seasons, but from the server rack point of view, like, how do you start laying down those first? Do you need to do it all at once in the context of, like, if you were to build a building, you would put all the racks in at once? Is the same thing here? But so then it takes on this like infrastructural quality, but then it also relates to kind of historic divisions of parcel division, which I think is also really, for me, interesting. And I think that question that Charles pointed out about the role of the edges, and I'm really excited to see the rendering not from the middle of the tennis court, but from where like the red building hits one of the corners, or driving down the street where you see all of the terminal positions. Like, there's just so much richness to it, which is, I think, where there's possibly a kind of major opportunity still. Because I was thinking about this like enfilade question, because it brings to mind other urban projects that have a lot of linear adjacency. I mean, Parc de la Villette, but then that's adjacency. Like, it's not that you make a transition. You don't pass through something else before getting to the new one. And so it seems like that moment is like a really interesting promise, because each time you leave something and you come back onto it, and then there's this crazy scale. So it's not just like one tennis court. It's like 1,000 tennis courts, and so then that starts to do something really weird and surreal. And so it seems like there's a chance here to really kind of explode the possibilities of what kind of atmospheres you could create that wouldn't be, and it's kind of, I think, what Marina was gesturing to as well, where you might be able to kind of move into a much stranger set of experiences that wouldn't just be these sort of familiar recreational objects, but I mean, even those lose their familiarity when multiplied over the scale of your project. So I think that there's something really exciting about that, the configuration, but it also feels like, a little, I guess what I'm trying to say is, like, there's nothing timid about the project, so there's no reason to not be, more, to give yourself more permission to do stranger things in the context of the spaces, because already the whole thing is, you've given yourself permission through the way you've set the project up in a compelling way, which is a great sign, I think.
Okay, Fernando, thank you so much. Great work.
Thanks for all the comments.
I'm gonna keep going, just so as we keep on schedule. Destiny, I think you're up next.
Yep.
It's all yours.
Sounds good. And let me know if you can't hear this. I looked out over the greenery before me. When most people think landscape, rolling hills and lush forests come to mind. However, here the landscape spans vertically, with gardens stretching to the sky, running up the buildings, creating an impenetrable forest of springtime bloom. Located on my own balcony are rows of tomato, strawberry, and basil plants sprouting in the potters that house them. As I walked out onto my shared balcony, I noticed my neighbor tending to the plants in our common potter wall. Midsummer meant the tomatoes would soon be ready for harvest. While I was still new to this way of living, my neighbor's aged hands moved over each of the plants with precision and care that I one day hoped to have. She made me feel welcome to this community from the first day I met her, welcoming me with open arms and the knowledge I seeked in learning to grow my own food. Sun seeped through the areas between the potters, and I stepped forward, craving the warmth on my skin. Our balcony consisted of several potters, ranging in size, scattered throughout the numerous outcroppings in the wall. Some contained herbs, with others holding the less temperamental fruits and vegetables. My neighbor motioned me over, directing me to the watering can, noting which plants needed more, and teaching me the plants that didn't want to drown with the overwatering I was prone to doing. Luckily, my learning green thumb was able to be supplemented by not only my experienced neighbor, but also the greenhouse that was attached to our building. The greenhouse consistently produced delicious fruits and vegetables year-round that were available for purchase at the market below our apartments where I worked. A vertical farm resides in the back of my building. From my kitchen, I can see the source of the glow. Windows sat between me and the farm in order to allow transparency on where our food is coming from. Trays are stacked in rows, reaching 4 stories high. Currently, the trays are filled with a dense variety of greens, signifying that a harvesting day is approaching. Depending on where the food is at in its growing season, the trays range from fairly empty to lush with produce. LED lights illuminate the farm in cycles in accordance with the plant's circadian rhythm. Every part of the building is referenced back to the growth that is happening around the residents. The local fresh markets are supplied by the vertical farms on the other side of my kitchen wall. Okay, so my project is Agriculture as Facade, Data Gives Back. And the project focuses on different modules, tiered, balcony, and screen to emphasize facade as productive surface. Every part of the building is referenced back to the growth that is happening around the residents, from the terrace that is plentiful with fruits and vegetables to stepping into the apartment where the kitchen looks directly into the vertical farm. The rear of the building houses data storage centers run by a large technology company that is required to give back to the community it is housed in through a heat exchange system, warming the whole building with the heat exhaust. Below the apartment area are areas that can be utilized as food processing centers, restaurants supplied by vertical farms, and community greenhouses or fresh markets for the residents to shop at. So the project focuses on various forms of agriculture brought together into a community. The main form of agriculture the project focusing on is vertical farming to grow various fruits, vegetables, and leafy greens for the community. The various forms of vertical farms will exist throughout the project, utilizing LED lighting, stacked trays, and vertical walls. Another form of farming that is utilized throughout the project is greenhouse farming, focusing on fruits, vegetables, and leafy greens. Through the placement of greenhouses on the roof becomes a productive surface that supports the people living within the building. And supplementary forms of farming are used, such as the community farms and individual farming. And then a big part of this project is data giving back. So the project also moves data storage into new locations into the community life to maximize the utilization of the transfer of heat exhaust to residences and vertical farms. Currently, data centers are given a tax break in Ireland to open a facility. This has led to an influx of hyperscale data centers throughout Ireland, and these centers need to give back to the community in return. The data centers produce an excess amount of heat, and rather than expelling this heat into the atmosphere, this heat can be funneled back into the community through heat exchange system, then in turn allowing residents to heat their homes and nearby growing facilities, and this gives back to the community. The vertical farms provide food for the residents, and the residents in turn need the vertical farms to have people to work at, and this makes the vertical supplies the vertical farms with the fresh markets. And then for the site, so the site is kind of flexible for my project since it's based on building modules. One site that is proposed is North Bull Island outside of Dublin. So then this is what the site would look like. A tier module is placed with its terrace facing east and west, and located on these modules are a variety of plants, trees, fruits, vegetables can be grown on the facade of the building, resulting in productive surface. And then the interior of the building houses 2 levels of greenhouses that supply the residents with food, as well as a data center providing heat to the building. Another site that is proposed is Dublin Docks. The Potter greenhouse module is proposed to be located in the downtown area. This module focuses on a screen facade, and that is made up of several potters that contain the residents' choice of fruits and vegetables and herbs. The potters face east, south, and west to optimize the amount of sun that they receive. And a greenhouse is also located on the roof of the building, available to the residents. Below the greenhouse are vertical farms, and data centers also exist within this building to supply heat throughout the building. And so then I utilize references from other projects that can be integrated into the building modules. So a tiered structure, large potter walls, balconies, and algae walls. And the buildings will be modular with the option including parts of the reference project, such as the tiered structure, a potter screen wall, algae walls, growing balconies, while also including community and commerce areas, data storage, and community greenhouse, as well as residential. So the orientation of these modules can be placed independently or joined based on orientation. And these buildings support community food production and a new way of living. All programs exist within each building in a symbiotic relationship. The close proximity of food allows for a reduction in time and carbon footprint normally associated with food miles. And the food is supplied to local markets, restaurants, and the community. So there is a ratio of of farming to residential to data in each of these buildings, and it adjusts depending on the side. They generate a new way of living for the residents with a close relationship between food production, data, and life. Food will populate the community in a way that it hasn't before. Climbing up the buildings inside and out is a constant reminder of a new way of life. And each of these plans and sections show a different relationship that the building will have with the programs within them. And so these are the renders of the building, and they offer a look into what the residents would be seeing in their day-to-day lives, from the balconies to the Potter walls to the vertical farms that they're able to see from inside their residence. And then each apartment equals 2 to 4 residents, and that's 1,200 square feet per apartment. There's 950 square feet of data per resident, which ends up being 1,900 square feet of data per apartment. And in turn, that ends up being 3,125 square feet of farming per resident, which is a half acre per building. So each building can house up to 8 residents. Normally, this would look like 4 acres of traditional farming to feed a family of 4. And instead, with these modules, you can feed about 1 million residents, which is the approximate population of Dublin, in 24 square acres of these modules. And that is the project.
Thanks, Destiny. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Maybe because it was so well described, I have a very practical question. So sorry for that. I was all the time thinking, because I've been looking into these greenhouses in the Netherlands, and there is a question about light pollution.
Mm-hmm.
That's, it's almost impossible to see the stars. That's something that looks only romantic, but at the same time, it really alters ecosystems and the way in which we relate to the environment. And obviously, when we talk about living in a more denser space, I was imagining, I was curious to see how this space will look through the day and night, and what type of relations will be organized around that, like having these pink lights as something of your night experience of the city, which obviously could be very interesting and sublime, and even, create a particular aesthetic experience of the urban space. But at the same time, what type of other architectural devices or your techniques will have to be implemented to create also the possibility of blocking that light, or channeling it in a particular way. So I think that looking into that particular element that in a way was present in your first drawings, or those first images, but in a way is not included here, but at the same time will be a very prominent aspect of your project. That could be something interesting to consider. So yeah, I don't know if that's something that you were thinking at some point, or maybe, yes, something for the next.
I think it was like something that was, maybe it was considered but not completely developed, in the idea that everything kind of referenced back to being able to see like the vertical farms and like this food production around. So it was definitely something that like I wanted like the residents to be able to see that pink light and like have like that kind of flood through the buildings as a way to like be a constant reminder that like this is like a different way of living, and it kind of like has that emphasis on it. So
No, I think this is something beautiful also about to think about light, how it operates here, because on the one hand, also in the balconies, all this greenery also operates as a filter. And so there are different conditions in relation to, visibility and visibility, like access to light, and who is actually, in a way, there's something that I enjoy, that it seems to me that the comfort in terms of light is the plants, the ones who are at the center, and not the human. So the human has to negotiate the comfort of the plants and the needs in terms of light that the plants need to grow. And then you as human, you have to, get what you can, like either it's like pink light or filter lights through the windows and so on. So, and maybe it's something that I enjoy, thinking that many times not all the architecture that we have to design have to have the center, at the center, the comfort of the human. So here there's a level of negotiation that, probably the plants are happier than the humans, but maybe that's the point.
Well, the comment, I think what Marina's describing, I think the role of the different actors and agents involved here, and so the idea that somehow the happiness of the plants is foregrounded, makes me think of other kinds of actors and agents, and I one thing that I find fascinating about the project is the scale of its rollout that's implied in the site drawings, where you have this drawing of these large bars parked off of this beach. And I think that there's the kind of capacity question that, for me is I'm trying to kind of get my head around a little bit. I mean, one of the things that I think is really clever is that you identify these certain program uses like the greenhouse or the data center that are that don't need light, and so they can be self-contained, and then they can be sort of buried in these forms. And so this kind of ziggurat extrusion bar thing, you then solve the problem of the underside of that type because you don't need light in there. But I guess I'm trying to think about how I'm trying to think about the intermediate scale, but it's not the just the repetition of them, and it's not like that somehow, the scale of like the unit, of like the bar, not the kind of section cutaway, and then not the view from the territory, but what I'm trying to think about is whether we should think of these as infrastructural pieces, because the implication in that plan of the island is this could only come about. It looks like Cape Canaveral or something. Like this is brought about by a large state actor who's basically like implementing a new set of almost kind of emergency activities. But then there's this image, like the rendering and the films talk about these very small scale relationships of like the kind of like polite granny who's teaching you how to water plants. But then in the background, it's this like giant thing. So I don't have like a specific comment beyond that, but I'm curious to hear your own thoughts about that relationship between the scales, because it seems like there's a little dissonance between the kind of mega scale of the infrastructure and then the domestic scale of the activities that you're implying. But then the world that this exists in seems like it exists at another scale that's more at the infrastructural scale, but we don't see that as much in the documentation.
Yeah, so I was like definitely a lot of back and forth with the focusing on the two different scales, like working through this project. And so I think one of the reasons like that came about was because it was thought of as a module idea. And then that also then plays out at different scales because these modules can be put together in just like, two next to each other or become very large, like how you're talking about with being in the ocean. And so that kind of like push and pull on it, it was like something I wanted to explore, where I was like, okay, what does this look like at a human level? How is this being played out, which shows up in the movie render? Whereas like necessarily like at like this larger scale, it becomes more how this operates at a building level and not necessarily as much how it is like looking at as like a personal level. And throughout like the semester, kind of just like playing it out on different sites and going back and forth between whether or not this becomes something that necessarily has like one specific site, or if it wants to be something that's siteless and can be used in different areas just based on this orientation that kind of becomes the controlling factor of the module.
I mean, I appreciate what you're saying. I mean, I understand that. And I like that answer that you're thinking of it in this modular way. And I think it would be, I think it would be a valuable additional layer to think about. What point is there an economy of scale where the ratios change? Where once the module has accumulated to such a point that something else happens, like there's a kind of surface area to volume ratio at work here. It seems like where it's not just a linear growth. Like there's a point. It seems like where a few modules does one thing, but then 1,000 modules does something really different. And I think that's for me where I'd be interested in, seeing the project take shape.
Definitely, I like that.
Thanks, Destiny. I think it's a fascinating idea to mix these three programs, kind of stack them, kind of imbricate them in a way. Just a couple of naive questions, apologies. So the stepping, what I take to be the kind of apartment terrace kind of stepping, that's south facing, do I have that right?
So this one can be south facing if it is standing on its own, but if it has the other one stacked up against it on its backside, then it becomes an east-west facing building.
Got it. Okay. And just because it's obscured in the view that I have just now, tell me about the north side or the opposite, what would be the right-hand side of this drawing. What is that? Presumably that's a different condition than the ones on the left-hand side.
Yeah, so the back of the building would end up containing the algae wall, which is the side of the building that you don't really get to see as much because it's something that's facing north. It's not dictated by sun in the same way that the other relationships are.
Cool. Yeah, that's a good answer. It's very well presented. I mean, I've got a couple of smaller bore comments, but I put in the chat a link to something this made me think of, which is the work of Avalos Senkovic. So Iñaki Avalos has been for some time thinking about a kind of thermodynamic approach to building section. And in there, you'll find a series of projects and essays. And most often he's referring to multi-use, like urban multi-use building projects that include a metro, a train station, a commercial shopping mall, residential. And he's had this idea, which your project reminds me of very much, which is the idea of a kind of a stacking based on thermal envelopes. And he's interested in a couple of things there. He's interested, on the one hand, excuse me, on the one hand, he's interested in the idea of optimizing their individual performances, but then of course also arranging them in such a way to arrive at something that is complementary. And I think your section approach very much reminds me of that. One of the qualities of that approach, at least for Avalos, has been you end up in some like intuitive, non-obvious, counterintuitive solutions. Like things end up being organized in a modular way, and therefore I appreciate this sectional approach, which is let's look at the thermal relationship between these elements. In this case, you've got these three pieces. You've got this kind of industrial scale kind of greenhouse production that's a black box surrounded or at least edged by these server racks producing heat, and then these step terraced apartments. And all of that makes a lot of sense to me. I wonder, did you look at inverting that in terms of its thermal performance? I wonder if in fact placing a denser array of server racks at the center of the whole diagram might not distribute heat more completely. I don't know that. We'd have to test that. But from my point of view, the intuition that the server racks as a surface that want to dissipate heat in large quantities are producing heat that you will then also need and want within this industrial array suggests to me that you might invert their relationship, or maybe think of it as a kind of a server rack at the center, industrial greenhouse around that, and then glass on the outside of that. And that might get you 2 or 3 layers of kind of productive feedback. I do like the mixing of the residential use. Like the residential use pushes the project and problematizes it in certain ways. I don't know whether it would be pleasant to look through an algae wall or have these things, but I like the juxtaposition of them. The plant material that you're showing both on the terraces and on the roof